Hey everyone, welcome to a new devlog for Project Dagger. In this devlog, I'm going to talk about accessibility. So, one day, as I was working on solving an issue with one of my game systems, I stumbled upon a Steam forum post for a game I never heard of titled Eastshade. And the post was regarding players wanting the ability to remap keys to whatever they wish, as many of them were either left-handed or had different preferences. And this post got me thinking, regarding other people who may have health complications and or problems where they can only play with one hand at a time, or just prefer a different style of using their keyboard and mouse for playing games. Immediately, I got to work creating a manager that stores the actions for the game as an enumerator, and then created a custom class to store the enumerator in the key code so Unity can process inputs. I then created an array of the class with some default values and set up a method that can be called to listen to inputs in order to remap whatever of Unity's over 100 key codes to specific actions within Project Dagger. This whole process reminded me of a few games, notably like games like DayZ, where at certain times you couldn't actually remap keys. You know, whenever you go from similar game to similar game, say Rust to DayZ, you have certain keys in mind that you want to use whenever you play those games. And so having to retrain yourself isn't always an easy task and isn't always a fun thing to do. It often leads to a lot of frustration. So being able to allow players to do whatever it is that they want. So, you know, if the inventory key for them, if they want it to be G versus tab or even pressing E, then I wanted that to be an option for anyone and everyone. However, once I finished setting up dialogue controls, interactions, and menu controls, I moved on to player movement. The player controller in Project Dagger, as well as all inputs in the game, still use the old input system, and the player controller uses input axes. These input axes have one issue, and that is the controls for them cannot be rebinded at runtime, and have to be changed in the project settings before building the game. This ended up being a huge problem for me, as I've never used the new input system before, and didn't know how I felt about upgrading to it over a year and a half into Project Dagger. So I got to brainstorming, and figured that if the input axis is a float that goes from -1 to +1, depending on the keys that are pressed, where if we're using W, A, S, and D for movement, the W key goes from 0 to 1, and S goes from 0 to -1. A goes from 0 to -1, and D goes from 0 to +1. Knowing this, I decided I was going to create my own input axis to drive player movement, as well as some of the other fancier camera movements that also rely on the same input axes. So, I created an input manager class and created a vector for. That way I could store values of -1, 0, or 1, depending on what key was pressed, with there being 4 movement keys total. I found though, while whole integers were great for the player controller, they weren't entirely great for the camera controls. Even though I used Unity's input axis for the player controller, I only used getAxis raw, which does not return a float or a value with decimal points, but just the whole integer. So I also needed just a normal getAxis method, which would return a float. So I decided that I needed to change the system around. That way the camera controller could end up working the proper way. The thing about the camera controller is that whenever you go left to right, there is a slight tilt to the camera, which just gives it a really nice kind of polished, refined feel. So I need to change the system around, and then that way I can get the normal kind of gradient of values going from -1 all the way to +1. How I did this was by creating 2 enumerators, one titled vertical movement and one titled horizontal movement. Essentially, vertical has a value of forward, backwards, and none, and then horizontal has the value of left, right, none. When I press keys on my keyboard like W, A, S, and D, it'll change a vertical movement variable and a horizontal movement variable. Then I subtract or add from the value in the vector for by time.delta time until it reaches either -1 or +1, depending on what key is being pressed. I did some other work as well, just to tie it all together and make sure it worked properly and that there weren't any situations that I was missing. So when I tested out the player controller and the camera controller, they were both indistinguishable from using Unity's default input axis. Now, keys can all be rebinded to whatever they want, and with complete ease. So I got to keep using the original Unity input system for the most part, and then also added some nice accessibility to the game's controls. One of the great things is that, say someone can't always use the keyboard, say they only have one hand available, you can rebind the right mouse button to be the forward movement. That way you can move and attack at the same time, and it's pretty fun. Also, say if your mouse has more than just 2 buttons and a scroll wheel, all those other buttons can also be rebinded to whatever you want them to be. So that was all I got accomplished that day, and then the next day I ended up getting to work on localization. Currently, there is a spreadsheet that I've developed where you have a list of game strings that can then be read into a CSV reader. So I take the spreadsheet and I export it as a .csv file, which is like comma separated values. And then I also have at the same list English, Portuguese, and French. So currently there's only 3 languages that are supported, but I really do hope to get more people involved with translating the game. The localization system itself though was quite a pain to develop because building the game out, everything's in English and dynamic strings, so say like press F to pick up, whatever item. Well, that F is now being kind of spliced into the string based off the Keybind manager. But now it's like I also have to think about how do I structure that so sentences in other languages make sense, and just overall how to build out those dynamic strings and even just help changing static strings to the proper language. But I ended up getting it all working, so now the game is fully playable in Portuguese, English, and French. It was quite a journey overall to get it to that point, but I really do look forward to the community and other people helping translate the game. I do have a public repository up right now over on GitHub, which has a link to the spreadsheet and then kind of just like the rules and ideas of how to structure the spreadsheet, as well as an example with the English, French, and Portuguese ones. So anyone that's interested that knows a language other than English and wants to contribute to the development of Project Dagger, I would highly recommend checking out the link in the description and maybe seeing about helping translate the game into another language. Currently, the main languages that I am looking for is Turkish, Japanese, Korean, Russian, Polish, and Spanish. So if you know any of those languages and you can read and write, then I would highly recommend, again, checking out that repository and helping me out. But yeah, that's going to end it for this devlog. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and wishlist Project Dagger on Steam right now. We're just over 1,000 wishlists and we're almost at 1,100, so I definitely want to get those numbers up, and any wishlist helps. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.